Tanya Miles had followed every rule. She kept her voice steady, her tone respectful. And yet, she still ended up being treated like a criminal escorted out of the boarding area like she'd caused a scene. All because of a carry-on bag. She hadn't been late. That fact repeated in her mind as she wheeled her small navy suitcase across the polished tile floors of the airport toward the security line. It was just past noon, and her flight to Phoenix wasn't for another 90 minutes. She had time to grab a bottle of water, maybe skim through a magazine, and finally take a breath. It had already been a week full of stress, her daughter's surprise dental procedure, a last-minute meeting reschedule, and now a business trip for a client she could barely stand. But Tanya knew how to carry chaos with dignity. That's who she was. The airport bustled like airports do, brisk, impersonal, and indifferent. Still, she moved through it with practiced calm, following signs, checking her gate, blending in. Security had been smooth, no issues. After clearing TSA, she made her way to gate B6. Along the way, she passed the usual airport scenes. A young mom bribing her toddler with snacks, a man aggressively tapping at his phone, and a gate agent calling out standby passengers' names. Normal travel energy. She found a seat near the window and pulled out her book. When Group 3 was called about 10 minutes later, Tanya stood, adjusted her blazer, grabbed her roller bag, and joined the line. When she reached the front, the gate agent, an older man with a thinning patch of blonde hair and a badge reading K. Delaney, barely glanced up before stating flatly, "Ma'am, that bag won't fit in the overhead. You'll need to check it." Tanya blinked. "It's a standard carry-on. I've flown with it all. You never had an issue." Delaney didn't budge. "Not on this flight. You'll have to check it." She kept her voice polite. "I really can't. I have medication in there that needs to stay with me." At that, he looked up for the first time, his expression changed, eyes narrowing. "You're holding up the line, ma'am," he said, louder this time. She could feel passengers shifting behind her. Some murmured. Still, she remained composed. "I'm not trying to be difficult," she said gently. "If necessary, I can remove the medication, but I do need to keep it with me." "You're being uncooperative," he snapped, cutting her off. The word hit her like a slap. "Sir, I'm just trying to have a conversation," she replied, keeping her tone even. "There's no need for hostility." He turned to a younger female employee nearby. "Get security." Tanya's breath caught. "Wait, what? Are you serious? You're being combative, ma'am. Please step aside." Her heart pounded. She looked around, hoping someone would intervene. But most people averted their eyes. A few raised their phones to start recording. The young mother from earlier clutched her child protectively. "I didn't raise my voice," Tanya said clearly. "I didn't curse. I didn't threaten anyone." "Security's on the way," Delaney repeated. "Step aside." She took a step back, hands visible, lips tight. She wasn't going to give him anything to twist. Two airport police officers arrived moments later. Tanya calmly explained what had happened. They didn't ask many questions. Instead, they told her she was being removed for noncompliance. One officer lightly grasped her elbow as they led her away from the gate. Tanya didn't scream. She didn't argue. Not because she wasn't furious, but because the whole thing felt so absurd it was almost surreal. She had done nothing. Everyone in that line had seen it. And yet, here she was. They guided her past several gates and down a hallway to a small, quiet waiting area lined with stiff blue plastic chairs. One officer told her to sit and wait. Someone from airport management would speak to her shortly. Then they left. Tanya sat alone. She checked her phone. One missed call from Morris, her husband. Her chest tightened. She exhaled and called him back. He answered immediately. "Morris," she said, voice catching. "What happened?" His voice was calm, but firm. "They kicked me off the flight." A pause. "What? Why?" "They said I was uncooperative." "Over my carry-on. Where are you?" "Some holding area near gate B." "I don't even know. They just walked me here." "Don't move," he said. "I'm already parked." What happened next would make the entire airport pause. People turned to look as Tanya sat silently in the waiting area, her posture upright, legs crossed, hands knotted tightly in her lap as though holding herself together. She hadn't been crying. Her face was calm. But her eyes, when she saw Morris, said everything she couldn't speak. Morris didn't walk, he moved. Purposefully. Long strides. shoulders squared, a leather briefcase in one hand. His presence shifted the air. A woman juggling coffee and a boarding pass barely noticed him pass. Neither did the teens dragging skateboards near the vending machines. He was already locked in on Tanya. He crouched in front of her. "You all right?" he asked gently. She nodded once. That was all she could manage. Morris didn't ask anything else. Instead, he stood and turned to the nearby desk marked Passenger Services. A young man in a navy vest looked up. "Can I help you, sir?" "Yes," Morris replied evenly. "My wife was just removed from her flight without cause. I want to know why. And I want to see the security footage from the gate area." The agent blinked. "Sir, I'm not sure that's something we can provide." "You can," Morris said calmly. "I'm making a formal request. Please call your supervisor." The agent hesitated, then picked up the phone. Back in her seat, Tanya finally exhaled. "I didn't yell," she said quietly. "Didn't curse. I just didn't want to check my bag." Morris shook his head. "You don't need to explain anything to me." Within minutes, two supervisors approached. One wore a name tag, C. Jensen. The other's shirt simply said supervisor. They both wore tight smiles, the kind meant to look pleasant but never reach the eyes. "Mr. and Mrs. Jensen began. "Miles," Morris interjected. "And before we go further, I'd like to officially request all internal communication, footage, and the names of every staff member involved in my wife's removal." "Sir, I assure you—" "No need to assure me," Morris cut in. "I'm not here for promises. I'm here for accountability." The room shifted, the air tightened. "At least tell me," he continued, "why exactly was she removed?" "She was non-compliant," Jensen said carefully. "She refused to follow the gate agent's instructions to check her bag." "I told him I had prescription medication inside," Tanya said, her voice clear but controlled. Jensen paused. "That wasn't reported to us." "No one asked," she replied. "No one cared." Morris turned to both supervisors. "Did anyone inspect the bag before removing her?" "No, sir. So how can you claim she was unreasonable?" Neither supervisor answered. Around them, foot traffic began to slow. People noticed the conversation. A woman whispered, "That's her, the one they kicked off." Another quietly raised a phone to record from across the hallway. Morris didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. She followed policy. She remained calm. And yet she was humiliated in front of dozens of people. Why? Because someone with a badge chose escalation over professionalism. Jensen cleared his throat. "We'll be reviewing the incident thoroughly." Morris held his gaze. "Good. Because I know what FAA guidelines require. I know what bias looks like when it hides behind the word policy." Silence. Then a woman in a blazer approached breathless, holding a folder. "Sir," she said to Morris, "we're reviewing the footage now. Would you and your wife be willing to meet with our head of security?" Tanya stood slowly. "Now you want to listen," she said. Her voice was steady, not loud. "You didn't listen when I was calm. You didn't care when I explained. You only started listening when you saw who my husband was." Jensen took a step back. "That's not what this is about." "But it is," Tanya said firmly. "It's exactly what this is about." They were led to a small, windowless conference room. Long table, 6 stiff chairs, a screen mounted on one wall. It smelled of filtered air and corporate distance. Across from them sat 2 security officers and a woman in a dark blazer with her ID badge flipped backward. Her name, unreadable. "I'm Lynn Ortega," she introduced herself. "Director of Passenger Relations. We've reviewed some of the footage and would like to go over it with you." Morris crossed his arms. "We're not here to watch video," he said. "We're here because my wife was degraded and removed like she was a threat. So tell us, what did your video show?" Ortega hesitated, then answered. "It shows your wife remained calm. She was not confrontational. She clearly explained she had medical necessities in her bag. The gate agent escalated the interaction without cause." Morris raised an eyebrow. "Then why was security called?" "I don't have a clear answer," Ortega admitted. Tanya leaned in. "I do. Because I didn't cave. Because I didn't look scared. Because I didn't say yes sir and let that man treat me like I was beneath him." No one responded. Morris opened his case and slid a folder across the table. "This is a formal request for all internal reports, employee statements, and a copy of the footage." Ortega nodded. her tone shifting. Understood. I also want the names of every person involved in the decision to remove my wife. This isn't a complaint, I'm building a record. The room went still. His voice never rose. It didn't need to. The weight of his words filled every corner. I want to be clear, he continued. This isn't about getting someone fired. This is about the fact that my wife isn't the first black woman to be treated like a threat just for speaking up. You have staff with too much power and too little training. This isn't a one-off, it's a pattern. Ortega looked down. We take those concerns seriously. Sure you do, Morris said. When there's paperwork, when a lawyer walks in, when the press gets involved. But what about the people who don't have someone to speak for them? One of the security officers shifted uncomfortably. Do you know what would have happened? Morris continued. If Tanya had raised her voice even once, no answer, she would have been detained. Maybe banned from flying, flagged in your system. And you'd have written a very different version of this story. Ortega said quietly, we want to make this right. Tanya finally spoke again. Then stop calling it a mistake. Stop saying it was an incident. Call it what it is, a system that treats people like me as a threat when we're just standing our ground. Ortega nodded, slower this time. I hear you. Morris's expression didn't shift. You hear us now because we backed you into a corner. Outside, the normal airport chaos hummed on boarding calls, gate changes, overhead announcements. But something had shifted in that room. Morris stood. I'll be speaking with the press. And when they ask why my wife was escorted away without reason, I'll give them your statement. The one that confirmed she was calm, compliant, and still removed. Ortega stood too. We'll be issuing a formal apology. That's a start, Tanya said. Her tone was cool, but composed. But Morris wasn't looking for just an apology. He was building something much bigger. They didn't walk back into the terminal like people defeated. Tanya walked tall. Morris beside her, step for step, stride for stride. People stared. The same faces that had watched her get escorted away now watched her return with quiet respect. Some looked ashamed, some recorded silently, no longer out of curiosity but solidarity. The first person to approach wasn't a guard. It was a man in a gray polo with a radio clipped to his belt. Mr. Miles, he asked. I'm Kent, Airport Operations. Morris didn't shake his hand. Go on. We've placed the gate agent on temporary leave pending a full investigation. Tanya's voice cut in. So someone finally told him he was wrong. We're still reviewing the full context. No, she said, sharper now. I want to hear you say it. I wasn't mistaken, was I? Tanya asked quietly. Kent hesitated, then gave a slow nod. No, ma'am. From everything we've reviewed, he mishandled the situation. For the first time that day, Tanya allowed herself a small smile, not from satisfaction, but because someone had finally acknowledged the truth out loud. We've also arranged for both of you to fly first class on the next available flight, Kent added. No charge, of course. Morris raised an eyebrow. We didn't ask for extras. I understand it's just a gesture. Tanya interjected before he could continue. Don't offer me silence all morning and then try to smooth it over with a seat upgrade. That's not the point. Kent stepped back, nodding. Understood. Something shifted after that. People around them began to speak. I saw what happened, said a woman seated near gate B6. You handled yourself with such grace. I was heartbroken watching it unfold. A young man with a laptop bag added, I was on that flight. The way he treated you, it wasn't right. One by one, voices joined in, not loudly, not all at once, but steadily. Alongside their words came their own stories. A man recalled how his wife had once been pulled aside for looking too nervous at check-in. A grandmother said her teenage grandson was removed from a flight for walking too slowly back to his seat. Tanya listened. Morris jotted down notes not for pity, but to build something real. Then a reporter appeared. She had a notepad, short hair, and that composed look of someone who'd been tipped off. Mr. and Mrs. Miles, she asked gently, would you be willing to speak on camera? Tanya glanced at Morris. He said nothing, just looked at her. The choice was hers. I will, Tanya said. Not because I want attention but because people need to understand what it's like to be treated like a threat before anyone even asks you a question. The reporter nodded at her cameraman, and they began recording. Tanya stood where she'd been removed just hours earlier, same floor, same row of chairs. But this time, no one was calling security. No one looked away. She spoke without anger, just truth. I came here to fly to Phoenix. I had a ticket. I followed every rule. I stood in line like everyone else. But when I questioned something that felt wrong, I was treated like a problem instead of a person. She looked into the lens. Ask yourself, would it have gone the same way if I looked different, if my voice didn't sound like this? If I'd been standing next to someone who looked like my husband the entire time, the terminal grew still, airport quiet. People listened with a kind of guilty silence, the kind that comes when you realize you might have looked away too. Morris stood nearby, quiet. This wasn't just his to fight. It never had been. The clip aired that evening on KPXE Channel 9. But by then, it was already spreading, shared on social media by people Tanya barely remembered, clipped into a TikTok by a student 2 gates away. The headline was blunt: Black woman removed from flight after carry-on dispute. Airport investigating after husband speaks out. It spread quickly. With it came voices, some angry, some supportive, some defensive. But mostly, it struck a chord in those who had carried similar moments silently for years. The emails began, hundreds of them. One from an older woman in Tallahassee read, I cried watching your interview. My daughter experienced the same thing at LaGuardia. We stayed quiet. I wish we hadn't. Another came from a man in Oregon. I've worked airport security for almost 2 decades. What happened to your wife isn't rare. Don't let them bury it. This wasn't just about Tanya anymore. It had become about assumptions, about policies, about how fast judgment forms based on appearance, not behavior. 2 days later, Morris was invited to speak at a panel on civil rights and public service. Tanya stayed home. She needed space. But she watched. Morris didn't mention her name. Didn't recount the incident. He talked about something deeper. How many of us have watched something wrong happen and said nothing because we didn't want to make waves? He asked. Let me be clear, silence doesn't protect you. It protects the ones doing harm. The moderator, a professor from Arizona State, nodded. What's the solution, Morris? There's no single answer, he said, but it begins with accountability, with retraining, with rewriting policy, and maybe most importantly believing people, even when there's no camera rolling. Back home, Tanya sat at the kitchen counter, sipping tea as she scrolled through emails. One message from a woman in Ohio stopped her. I work for an airline. At our staff meeting today, your story came up. My supervisor played the clip. I watched the entire room change. You changed the room. Tanya read it 3 times, then replied with 2 simple words, thank you. The next morning, Tanya received a call from a woman named Marlene Alvarez, a representative of a nonprofit that advocates for passenger rights. I was wondering if you'd consider speaking at a roundtable in Sacramento, she asked. I'm not a public speaker, Tanya replied, uncertain. You don't need to be, Marlene said. Just be honest. And you already are. Tanya said she'd think about it. That evening, she sat outside with Morris under a clear sky. I never asked for any of this attention, she murmured. I know, he said gently. But pretending it didn't happen, that's not right either, she nodded slowly. I just don't want to be remembered as the woman who got kicked off a plane. I want to be remembered for speaking up. You will be, Morris said, reaching for her hand. 2 weeks later, Tanya stood on a small stage at the Travel Equity Forum in Sacramento, not because she wanted the spotlight but because she knew it was time. The audience was modest, maybe 100 people. Airline staff, advocates, a few passengers with stories of their own. A man in the back streamed the event live. She wore a navy blouse and black slacks. A clip-on mic rested on her collar. The moderator introduced her briefly and stepped aside. Tanya didn't shuffle papers, didn't clear her throat. She simply began. When I walked into that airport in Raleigh, I expected a normal flight. I had my suitcase, my itinerary. What I didn't have, she paused, was the benefit of the doubt. Every ear leaned in. I didn't shout. I didn't curse. I asked a question. But instead of being heard, I was labeled not for what I did, but for how I looked. And it happened fast. She described how the gate agent raised his voice first. How no one asked her for her side of the story. How no one wrote her name down until Morris arrived, and that hurt most of all. I needed someone with authority beside me just to be seen as a human being. A ripple of emotion moved through the crowd. I'm not here to get anyone fired, she said. I'm here because I've lived with that moment, and I know others have too. I'm tired of pretending we just have to accept it. She took a breath. You know what kept me up that night? Not the embarrassment, not the media. It was that not one person in that boarding line said a word. Not one. The room held its breath. Maybe they were scared. Maybe they didn't know what to say. But let me make it clear next time, speak. Ask why. You don't need a badge or a title to do what's right. In the front row, Marlene Alvarez wiped a tear from her cheek.